Coming up, Alan K. Rohde joins Ileana in just a minute.
Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
And now, it's the I Blame Dennis Hopper podcast, starring Ileana Douglas. Eavesdrop with Ileana as she interviews Hollywood's most prominent players about filmmaking, acting, and what really happens on the set of your favorite flicks and TV shows.
What really happens?
I don't know. You know. You have to tell us.
It'll all be in the second book. Outrageous stories. Welcome to the I Blame Dennis Hopper podcast. We are live today. I'm with my lovely co-host, Tamara Berg.
Hi, everybody.
And we're going to be talking to Alan K. Rohde. He's a longtime friend. Of course, I know him from Turner Classic Movies, but he's a writer, a historian. He's written this incredible book on Michael Curtiz, which we are going to talk about. And, of course, he is a film noir expert and also works with our other pal, Eddie Muller.
Yes.
But I wanted to talk two things today. One was I must mention the passing of author Tom Wolfe,
Yes.
who contributed so much to my childhood. I remember growing up seeing in my parents' bookshelf, you know, the electric Kool-Aid acid test. That was that was the book that every late 60s parent
was reading at the time.
Was reading, and it affected a generation, and people like Dennis Hopper and my family, it certainly led them down the road of being hippies. But two of his incredible books, of course, made into movies. The Right Stuff, which I mean, I think is one of the most amazing films, which when it first came out, I don't think it did particularly well. But it's so beautiful whenever...
Incredibly memorable film.
Yeah, whenever you get a chance to see it. And then the other one on the opposite end of the spectrum, the Bonfire, the Vanities, which I remember reading the Bonfire, the Vanities when I was in New York, probably going to acting school or something like that. That was a book I didn't want it to come to the end. I thought it was one of the greatest books. And then the movie with... Bless his heart, I love Brian De Palma, but maybe not...
Didn't translate so well, did it?
Just was not... That's one of those movies like it was our generation's Gone with the Wind.
Right.
Everybody cast the lead part, and I think everyone in the universe wanted William Hurt to be the lead guy.
Right.
And so then when it went to Tom Hanks, it just didn't seem, particularly right. Everyone was very upset about the casting of it. But the book is so incredible. And so I don't know. It makes me want to go back and see Bonfire of the Vanities just to see. I love looking at any movie from the early '90s. Anyway, there was that time in New York where they were making a lot of movies.
Oh,
there.
right.
And then the other person I just wanted to briefly talk about, because I have been obsessed my whole life with Joseph Cotten, and I came to find out. Reading his book not many years ago, that he was the understudy for my grandfather in this play he did called Tonight or Never. And when Gloria Swanson picked him to be her leading man and he went to Hollywood, Joseph Cotten went on for him, and that's what started his career. This is before he met Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater and all of that. So I can say there's a connection. But what I loved about Joseph Cotten, I mean, first of all, Shadow of the Doubt, I just think and he never won an Oscar. He's another person who never won an Oscar. But he was the guy, when I think of movies like The Third Man, Duel in the Sun, Niagara, which is incredible. I mean, we're talking about noir. That's like a color noir. It's one of my favorite Marilyn Monroe movies. But he never got the girl. He always sort of, wore his heart on his sleeve. And he was like the long-suffering guy coming to the girl's rescue. But I was
friend-zoned it.
Yeah, so I was always kind of obsessed with him. And also, quite famously, he's in the movie Beyond the Forest, which was Bette Davis's, the famous line where she comes in and says, "What a dump."
What a dump.
And that was her last movie at Warner Brothers. So he was part of that.
Oh, wow.
Gaslight. With
God.
Ingrid Bergman. I think people forget how many, and then everybody who's listening is yelling out, Portrait of Jenny, and other films that he was in. Oh my God, and of course The Third Man, how could I? He's so spectacular in The Third Man. I mean, there'd be no movie. I mean, of course Orson Welles is amazing, but his portrayal of Holly Martins in The Third Man, I just fell like madly, madly in love with him. And the last thing I was going to say about him is for Shadow of a Doubt. I wrote a piece many years ago for Esquire magazine about Joseph Cotten in the film Shadow of Doubt, because that's my favorite Hitchcock movie. And his performance, he plays Uncle Charlie, and then Teresa Wright is his niece Charlie, and she discovers, that he is the Merry Widow killer, and she has to, reluctantly turn him into the police and all of that. And I just thought it was such a layered performance, and there's this really interesting thing, I think, with Teresa Wright and him, where it's really about finding out, that the man that you're, kind of in love with or kind of have a crush on, that older man is, in fact, a murderer. And I always thought
I hate it when that happens.
there's a very subversive kind of idea in that film, because they have the same name and she likes him, and she looks up to him, and there's a kind of a romantic underpinning to that relationship. And I always thought that it has to deal with a woman sort of growing up and maturing and going from girlhood to womanhood, and because then the policeman who she ends up with is like a complete stiff. I always liked Uncle Charlie.
Oh yeah.
But just so watch a Joseph Cotten movie for that, and then
Did you say this on the air? I don't remember if you did. That it's his birthday, or
It's
would
his
be his birthday.
birthday.
That's why you're bringing him
That's
up,
why I'm
right?
just obsessing about him.
Got
May
it.
15th.
Got it. So when I was reading notes
Yes.
for today's podcast, you mentioned very casually something called pre-code Hollywood, and
Right.
I was not familiar with that term.
Really?
Yeah. So for anybody else who might be in the dark like I am, can you explain that? Because I'm sure you're going to be talking about it with Alan.
We are. Pre-code it's become very in vogue to watch pre-code films, because the Hays Code. They say, and it's funny, Alan's probably going to be obviously more of an expert on it than I am. But basically, they were just making movies. There were stories. So if there was, scenes with depicting drug use or abortion,
prostitution,
or sleeping your way to the top. Right? It was like, lots of nudity. With scantily clad actresses and things like that. But the Hays Code came in at some time point in the 30s, and it happened around when there was like the Fatty Arbuckle case
Scandal.
and there was just to tamp down Hollywood's excesses, there were all these certain rules, and then one of those rules became that you couldn't be seen in the same bed, and that was that 2-bed rule. So Lucy and Ricky had to have 2 separate beds, and if you were on a bed, you had to keep
one foot on the ground.
One foot on the ground, and
Right.
and there always had to be a moral, something at the end of the film. The woman, and I think in Mildred Pierce too, there, again, you can't get away with murder, just things like that. So there were certain moral obligations to that, but that now. All of those films, which are pre-code, of course, are sought out and looked at because they're so free,
Right.
and they're very, very interesting, and they depict all sorts of, interesting subject matter. And I think it's a movie like Easy Rider in the late '60s that sort of broke all of that open. And then now now on television we have no code, which is almost, I find that a little bit too jarring. I find everything so graphic that before you know it, you're seeing something that you really don't want to see. I don't think anyone really looks at the warning. So I kind of like the code movies because they're as I quoted before, Ernest Lubitsch, Billy Wilder said he could do more with a closed door than other people could do with an open fly. So I always, I love that idea that it was very clever. But any kind of pre-code movie, you're bound to see mainly a lot of nudity. Scantily clad. I always think of women in their little slips in the 30s. Drinking to excess, snorting cocaine.
Like me on a Thursday afternoon.
Yes, very typical, very typical.
So I have just a little bit of specific information that
Yes.
the Hays Code was adopted in 1930, but oversight was poor and it did not become really enforced until the middle of 1934.
Yes, that sounds about right.
So
that sounds about
that's
right.
the timing for it anyway.
But you think of all those, I mean, even a movie like It Happened One Night is
Right.
like, I mean, they're sharing the same room
Sharing
and
a
they only
room.
have the little blanket
Right.
between them. And then there's a scene where she gets undressed and he's looking, I mean, it's very
Oh,
sexy.
right. He was looking at her. That's
Yeah.
right. Through in a mirror, in a reflection,
It's
or
through, I think there's her shadow is through
right,
the
yeah.
blanket, but
Yeah.
it's very, you know,
Very sexy. I
it's
agree
very
with you.
sweet. And I think some of the more obvious ones, you know, you couldn't say the word pregnant ever.
Yep.
So that was a big one. And then I know, I think
Couldn't show belly button.
I think it's the I don't know, with the I think the movie was called The Moon is Blue or something like. Is that the one where there's a few movies then in the 60s like where they got this, where they said pregnant, or The Pill, where you could see a toilet. I think Psycho was the first movie where they showed a toilet.
Toilet.
Yeah, so that was a big deal.
Huh.
Little things like that. And then it was
Fascinating.
either it's one of the Otto Preminger movies. They said Panties.
Oh,
with,
good gracious.
with Jimmy Stewart, which I suddenly am blanking on the name of it. You can tell me. But anyway, let's bring in
him
Alan.
in.
Let's bring in Alan K. Rody because he's going to know all about this. Alan is, aside from being just the co-host of all these great film noir festivals around the country, he is a writer, he's a film historian, he's an actor and a producer. I didn't know that. And he has written many books on film, including Michael Curtiz, A Life in Film. And he is co-hosting the upcoming Noir City Festival in Austin, Texas, this very weekend. I've been at Noir City, both at the Egyptian in Hollywood, and I've been at the one in San Francisco. It's quite amazing. And welcome, Alan K. Rody, to the show. And here's your book.
Hey.
Put your book up here. 700 pages. I'm impressed. Look at mine. Your book looks like it ate my book.
The
That's
book
great.
that ate Ileana's book. Sounds like a remake of a bad movie. Ileana, thanks so much for having me on. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And thank you for writing a book on Michael Curtiz. You know, one was needed. I mean, that's the, I don't want to get ahead of myself about the book because I have to start with my favorite question, but I'm going to be fascinated as to why Michael Curtiz. But before we get to that, I have to ask you my favorite question. Do you remember the first film you saw and who took you to see it?
Vividly.
Okay.
I'm gonna date myself a little bit. It was Old Yeller at the Colony Theater in Livingston, New Jersey. And my father had to take me out at the end of the movie because I was sobbing.
Of course.
And he took me into the lobby. And I think after that, most of the movies I went to were with my mother and my grandmother. But now the second movie I saw was more memorable. It was Radio City Music Hall. My grandma and my mother took my brother and I. We saw the Rockettes,
the
North
best.
by Northwest,
Oh, wow.
which was
Wow.
on a double bill with Sink the Bismarck, where I started developing this serious crush on Donna Winter at a very young age. It's funny how you always remember not only the films that you saw, but where you saw them.
Oh,
So,
definitely,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
The second film, as people often know this, the first movie I saw was at a drive-in, was Romeo and Juliet. The second film I saw was Paint Your Wagon at Radio City Music Hall.
Oh, wow.
And I developed that same weird crush on Lee Marvin. I became obsessed. I always liked the person that was rejected somehow. I was like,
Probably why I wrote a book on Charles McGraw and Michael Curtiz. I have the same feeling.
yeah, you
Yeah.
think, oh, they need to get.
Recognition.
So,
And love.
so of course, why Michael Curtiz? And thank you for writing this book because I want to let everybody know that I got to read it and it was fantastic. And
Thank you.
Sometimes people are afraid of a book that's going to be very dense, but it is chocked filled with like, you know, great gossipy Hollywood stories, and also stuff that I love, which is the beginnings of Hollywood. I cannot hear
Right.
too many times about, you know, a Hungarian emigre coming here, changing his name. You know, I love every bit of it. I'm all in. So go.
Well, I was casting about after I wrote my first book on Charles McGraw, and I was thinking, so what's my next? And I was ruminating on that, and Patrick McGilligan, the biographer and the series editor for this series of books at the University of Kentucky Press, we happened to talk, and he said, so what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I'm not sure. He said, you should write about a director. You should write a book about a director. So that got me thinking about that, and right around the same time, I was out to dinner with my old friend Richard Erdman, who is the last man standing from the Warner Brothers character actor stock company from the 1940s. And I was out to dinner with Dick, and he said, you need to write about Mike, because Mike discovered me out of Hollywood High School in 1944, and he did like a cold reading for Curtiz for the movie Janie, and a story that I included in the book, by the way. And so those two things set me on the path to Curtiz, and when I started doing preliminary research, I found that nothing substantive had really been written about him. A lot had been written about his films, but not about the person, other than the anecdotes and the broken English mixed with Hungarian, and he spoke 5 languages, all of them badly, and the temper tantrums on the set, and all of that anecdotal, gossipy stuff, some of which was true, some of which wasn't. So it got me into it, and it was a really quite a long odyssey, because from the time I conceived it to the time I held that book in my hand was about 7 years.
Wow.
So it was a long slog. And of course, I was doing a lot of other things in between then. But I'm really satisfied with the results. I appreciate the fact that you and so many other people like it. So in the end, I'm really happy with the outcome.
So I want to talk about his how he came. He was one of these people like Lubitsch who came over. He was a Hungarian emigre who was making films in Hungary.
Right.
One of the first shockers, as I said to you before we started, like, oh, he was married many times before he even. I always thought Bess Meredith was like his long-suffering wife, but I didn't.
Well, she was his long-suffering wife, and believe me, she suffered. But it was interesting. When he married her in 1929, he had already been married to a Hungarian actress named Lucy Dorain. He had had a child by her, and then he had 2 other children by women who appeared in his European movies. But he was born in 1886 in Budapest. He started as an actor. He was a classically trained actor, went to the Royal Academy, but he had this knack for directing on stage, and he saw the earliest films. I mean, he was watching the Lumiere brothers films in City Park in Budapest, projected in a tent around the turn of the 20th century. So he made his first film in 1912, his last film in 1961, and he really spanned most of the 20th century. And he made a whole plethora of films in Hungary. Then when World War I ended, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I mean, he grew up ruled by an emperor, if you can conceive that.
It's incredible, yeah.
He left, he went to Austria after the communists took over in 1919, and he worked for a producer named Count Kolorad and made all of these spectacular biblical-type films. And then Harry Warner saw him directing a film with Lily Demita, who was one of his earliest discoveries. And hired him in 1926, so he took the boat over, ostensibly to direct Noah's Ark in 1926, and that was when he came to Hollywood. And he stayed at Warner Brothers from 1926 to 1953.
It's incredible.
No other director that I know of is so firmly identified with the brand and helped develop the brand of a single studio than Michael Curtiz.
There are many pictures in the book, and every picture is interesting. He's included in, it's like Hal Wallace, Mike Curtiz, Jack Warner, they're in.
Oh, yeah. Well, he and Hal Wallace ended up becoming, initially were very adversarial because Wallace took over head of production at Warner Brothers when Darryl Zanuck left in 1933. And Wallace was a hands-on producer. I mean, this is the guy that put the parrot outside of Sidney Greenstreet's cafe in Casablanca. He was very, very hands-on.
Yeah.
And Curtiz would agree with him and say, I'm going to shoot the script. And then he would go down to the set and change dialogue, add and drop
Yeah.
scenes, change wardrobe. So the two of them bumped heads considerably until the adventures of Robin Hood.
I actually wrote this down. This is from the book.
Yeah.
Memo. You include this memo from Hal Wallace. I have talked to you about 4,000 times until I am blue in the face about the wardrobe.
Yeah.
It goes on, and we discussed each costume in detail and discussed the fact that when the men get to be pirates, that we would not have blood dressed up. Yet tonight in the dailies, in the division of the spoil sequence, here is Captain Blood in a nice velvet coat. And it goes on and on and on.
Oh, yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I love reading these. And how did you come across, how do you come across all these great memos?
Well, because Curtiz spent the balance of his career at Warner Brothers, at the University of Southern California, there is a building that holds the Warner Brothers archives.
Wow.
So back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, all of this material was found and donated by Warner Brothers to USC, and it's all been collated, organized.
Wow, that's great.
So you can literally, on some of these films, the earlier films, it's relatively incomplete. But on some of these films, like Casablanca, you can go through, and to a certain extent, you can reconstruct how the film was made and who was late and who didn't show up. And this is where you deflate the myths of George Raft was offered the role of Rick in Casablanca, which he never was, and all of these other things. And I think it's important as a biographer and a historian is you need to go back and try to put things into context and try to be separate myth from fact, like the Charge of the Light Brigade and the David Niven's book that said hundreds of horses were killed in Mexico.
Right.
As it turned out, that never happened. Not a frame of the film was not shot outside California, and so forth. So it's a lot of fun doing that. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of, I really enjoyed that part of it.
I want to go back to so when he first gets here, I found this, I love hearing about this. So his first big production of trying to make Noah's Ark, and again, this idea of, the scope of making a picture like that with all the thousands of extras, and then also the idea that, what you write about too, about all the people that there was no workplace safety at all, and
no, absolutely not.
And again, this is right from your book. Cecil B. DeMille said to a Christian slave, if any alligator gets you, the studio won't be responsible. It was,
that was, I took that instance, I was trying to illustrate the time where there was no OSHA, there was no workman's comp, there were no safety logs, there was no Screen Actors Guild.
Right.
It was basically the studio saying, do you want the job or not?
Right.
And in that particular instance, that was a stuntman named Joe Bonomo, and in 1932, DeMille was filming The Sign of the Cross, and Bonomo and stuntmen got paid by the stunt. So however much he had to jump into a pit of live alligators and roll around, and just before he did that, DeMille said, now remember, if any of the alligators get you, it's not the studio's fault.
That's unbelievable. So I was reading about that. I know, what does the director, I had a couple deaths today. I mean, just on the production report, it's just that's part of the risk.
Well, the production reports are notoriously missing in action for Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
And the Noah's Ark story of Curtiz dumping thousands of gallons of water on the extras, along with Daryl Zanuck, who was the producer and went along with that, has fastened into that bedrock of Hollywood folklore of 3 people were killed and this happened and that happened.
Right.
And obviously it was a minor catastrophe and a fiasco, because the stunt people, like the guy that jumped on the alligators, they were taking the risks, and they were paid to take the risks, and they knew what they were doing.
Right.
Extras who were just paid to stand around, and apparently in Noah's Ark they had some breakaway sets, and then they had some rigid sets where they had cattle, actors, and all these extras, including Andy Devine and John Wayne, who were picked for their athletic heft, because John Wayne was playing football at USC at that time. So what Curtiz did was constructed this whole thing of spillways, thousands of gallons of water and then planned to dump it on the fixed sets where all the people were, because he wanted realism.
Right.
And Hal Moore, the pioneer cameraman that shot a number of Curtiz's early films and shot The Jazz Singer, when he figured out what was going on, he went up to Curtiz and Zanuck and said, you know, you can't do this. I can't be a part of this. And they said, well, they're just going to have to take their chances. And Moore said, well, you can shove your picture. And he left, so they got another guy, Barney McGill, to film this thing. And when you see Noah's Ark, with these gouts of water coming down, knocking people over, it's not hard to imagine that a lot of people got seriously hurt.
Oh my God. Another sequence in the book I really enjoyed was learning a little bit about Frank Fay, the vaudevillian, who we don't know much about. He was married to Barbara Stanwyck. He was a vaudevillian, but they did 4 films together.
Right.
And just talk a little bit about who Frank Fay was. And
well, Frank Fay was a headliner in vaudeville and on stage, and he was the first guy that came up with the master of ceremonies monologue type patter that was imitated by Burl, by Johnny Carson, by all this other generation of comics, and he was a huge star. He was sarcastic, witty, he could make people laugh, he could ad-lib. When he came to Hollywood, he signed a contract with Warner Brothers, and all of that talent that he showed on the stage didn't translate in front of the camera. And you know, Ileana, there's stars and actors that the camera loves, and then there's stars and actors that the camera just doesn't happen on film. And for Frank Fay, it didn't happen. The other thing about Fay, aside from his marriage to Barbara Stanwyck, which ended up getting Deep Six, is he was alcoholic and he was a really terrible anti-Semite. So here he is coming to Hollywood for the first time, and they have him directed by a Hungarian Jew in jodhpurs that like to yell at people and so forth. So the Frank Fay Michael Curtiz relationship did not go anywhere, and their pictures together are interesting, but none of them were very good. A number of them lost money, and Fay's career in Hollywood was very abrupt, and it ended. And he and Barbara Stanwyck got divorced, and he had a return to fame when he went on Broadway with Harvey.
Right.
It was adapted with Jimmy Stewart, but he was, by all accounts, he was an egomaniac. He testified in a trial, and they asked him the perfunctory, what is your occupation? And he said, I'm the greatest living comedian. This was a guy that made Al Jolson look modest, So he was a difficult guy, but somebody who has really been forgotten. But he was a huge star on stage and in vaudeville.
Well, I was fascinated again by that part of the book, and then again it shows Michael Curtiz just as being a company man, handling difficult people, and moving up the ladder. So then the next difficult person he works with is Bette Davis.
Yes.
Does 7 films with Bette Davis, and she hated him too, or they eventually got along?
Well, yeah, she did not like him, and that might even be putting it mildly. The first film they did together was 1932, The Cabin in the Cotten. And Davis, at that time, was not a star. She was a contract player at Warner's. And she was assigned to play this kind of trampy, sexy, ingenue daughter of a plantation owner. And Curtiz didn't want her. He had someone in mind that he thought was more sexy and better for the part and everything. But she was under contract, so Zanuck and Warner said, you got to use her. So early in the production of that film, or in their early setups, he's behind the camera muttering, "No good, sexless, SOB, blah, 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 blah." And of course, Bette Davis had to take that.
Yeah.
She had to take that. And later on, she didn't. And so they made several pictures together, but their last picture was The Private Life of Elizabeth and Essex in 1939. But Bette Davis was at Warner Brothers another decade. She didn't leave till 1949, but she and Curtiz never worked together again. Curtiz didn't like people who ate lunch. Why would someone get hungry when Michael Curtiz is ready to direct a movie? And so he told Bette Davis, Don't eat lunch. We don't have
Yeah.
time for that. Just take an aspirin like I do.
Unbelievable.
And Betty Davis, as her star rose and she became the quote unquote fourth Warner brother,
Right.
she was a handful. I
Yeah.
mean, quite frankly, William Wyler opted. Part of his ability to get along with her is they were having an affair. During
That
the
always-
letter.
that always works.
That always kind of smooths things over. So, she wasn't easy, nor was Errol Flynn. And
Yeah.
Errol Flynn. Curtiz and Errol Flynn's reputation, they rose together. And, Flynn got a bit part in The Case of the Curious Bride. He had been signed in England by Warner's subsidiary, made a couple quota quickies that have disappeared, and then Jack Warner had him brought over.
Right.
And Wallace and Curtiz didn't want to use him, didn't want to do anything. And the guy, the credit of who gets the credit for discovering someone.
Right.
In the case of Errol Flynn, it really goes to Jack Warner because he really forced Hal Wallace and Curtiz to use him. And then when it came to Captain Blood, Warner's had signed Robert Donat, but he had bad asthma, and there was a suspicion that Alexander Korda wanted to keep him in England for the 39 Steps or something.
Yeah.
And Jack Warner's opinion, he sued. Jack Warner, if you signed a contract, if we have to wheel you into the soundstage on a gurney, that's okay. But they ended up going with Flynn, and of course Captain Blood made Errol the big star, and they kept putting him in these successive swashbuckling movies, Robin Hood, Charge of the Light Brigade.
Right.
And Flynn was not a secure actor, not secure in himself, and he really thought that Warner's and Curtiz was turning him into this caricature of a kid's comic book
Right.
in all these movies. So he resented that. And he resented Curtiz, the way Curtiz treated animals, actors, little people on the set, and so forth, and could be a bully. So finally, I think in 1941, when they made Dive Bomber, the story is that Flynn physically attacked Curtiz and
Wow.
started choking him, and they had to break it all up, and that was the end of their collaboration.
I can see why. I mean, how does he develop this crazy look? And then I feel like every movie, Singing in the Rain, depicts a director that sort of comes from
Yeah.
Curtiz, with the jodhpurs and the...
Yeah, it's kind of a caricature, and if you look at The Bad and the Beautiful,
Yes.
where they
Yeah.
have the actor paying the director and the jodhpurs and the
Yeah.
viewfinder
Yeah.
and all of that. A lot of that's based on Curtiz, but I do have to say that this was a guy that was very paradoxical, and as many people like Davis and Flynn who disliked working for him, there were a lot of other people that really enjoyed him. I interviewed Ann Blythe, and she said, "I adored Mike." And I almost dropped the phone, because
Yeah.
I wasn't used to hearing this. And I said, "Why did you feel that way?" And she said, "From day one, he was always in my corner, and he always stayed that way." John Garfield worked really well with him and liked him. Doris Day still calls him Mr.
Oh,
Curtiz.
I mean, yeah.
So for all of his detractors, he had a lot of people that were very fond of him. But he certainly was a guy who was respected more
Right.
than he was liked.
I want to get to that too, because the diversity of the amount of actors that he worked with is
It's incredible.
It's unbelievable. What was his directorial style like at this point? Before, this is we're going to get to the pinnacle of Casablanca, but
Sure.
is he finding his way? Again, from reading these memos, it seems like he's involved with every aspect.
Oh, he's involved with everything. And I have to give credit to, he married Bess Meredith.
Right, who was the writer.
Bess Meredith's career went back to D.W. Griffith.
Yeah.
And she made a series of films at Universal starring herself. She married an actor, went to Australia, came back. She wrote the scenario for The Silent Ben-Hur
Right.
in 24. So when Curtiz came, he got involved with Bess Meredith, and she was the star. She was the Hollywood royalty,
Right.
although his star obviously eventually outstripped hers. But she counseled him on studio politics, on scripts. She was a charter member of the Academy.
Right.
So his career without Bess would have been very, very different.
There-
And she really worked with him. Their marriage was really a partnership that
Right.
was bound together by the movies.
It again, there was a story. I don't know if it's apocryphal from one of the Casablanca movies where the writers would ask him a question and he'd say, "I'll be right back," and then this story went that he'd go call his wife or something like that.
There's certainly some truth to that. There's a story from Julie Epstein, one of the two Epstein brothers that got the Oscar for he got the Oscar for Casablanca. And he said that I wish I had recorded or filmed these story conferences with Curtiz where he'd say, we need to do, and then he'd go, oh, I forgot what Besky told me last night. So she certainly had a lot to do with that. But this is a guy that made so many movies. Just doing the filmography was like Cruel and Unusual Punishment. And I finally stopped at 181 movies that he directed whole or in part.
Yes.
Because Warner Brothers would bring him in if a director got sick or there was some problem. They would bring him in and they would say, film the beginning, the opening scene of Anthony Adverse. So he'd go up to Santa Susana with Frederick March, all these people, coaches and horses, and he'd just knock it out. And William Dieterle, who was one of Curtiz's proteges and an actor that Curtiz directed. He became a very renowned director, and he had a late-in-life interview where he said, even if they were rewriting the script, Jack Warner, Zanuck, Wallace expected the director to make progress and do something on the film, and he said, I couldn't do that. If I didn't have my script, I was helpless. He said Curtiz had such an instinct for film, he would figure out how to do something that was constructive to the film, even if the script was being rewritten or there was a problem with the star and so forth. He said, and if you didn't make enough progress at Warner's, they would get rid of you, usually replace you with Curtiz.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's get to, of course, then the sort of the pinnacle. Before I do that, though, we were talking about pre-code at the beginning of the top.
Sure.
Are there any of his pre-code movies you would recommend?
Oh, yeah. There's a number of them. One is called Mandalay with Kay Francis, Ricardo Cortez, and Lyle Talbot. And check this for a pre-code scenario. They're in Rangoon, which was up on the Russian River in Stockton in the winter.
Yeah.
And Kay Francis is wearing these like white gauze costumes. Everyone's freezing, and it's supposed to be in the tropics.
Of course.
So they're there. She plays this woman who's living on a boat with Cortez, who's a gun runner. They're obviously living together. Curtiz films this scene where she's naked in a bathtub, and Wallace said, "What the hell are you doing? Don't you know we'll never get this scene past the censor?" And Curtiz reshot it so when the towel drops from her and she embraces, it cuts to like the upper part of her leg. And you don't see anything. But Kay Francis owes the local crime lord, Sidney Toller, money, so he sells Kay Francis into servitude as a prostitute. So she becomes this prostitute that gets involved with this drunken, broken doctor played by Lyle Talbot. It is the most lurid pre-code film, but it's got such humanity in it. It's really a good film. Another one I would recommend is Goodbye Again with that pre-code cad Warren William. Joan Blondell. Warren William is a best-selling author who writes about romance and women and has had all these affairs. Joan Blondell is like his secretary, and they may be involved. They're not, or involved in one time. They're traveling together. And then Genevieve Tobin shows up. He's doing a signing in Cleveland or someplace, and she says, "Don't you remember me? You had an affair with me, and you promised to marry her." And Warren Williams can't even remember whether he slept with her or not. It's this very, very early screwball comedy. So those are a pair of his pre-codes that I'm really fond of.
Oh, great. And how does Casablanca come his way? Which is sort of, I guess you'd say, the pinnacle now of his.
Yeah, well, he was on a great run of outstanding movies. Angels with Dirty Faces, the Flynn movies,
Robin
Yankee
Hood.
Doodle Dandy.
Oh my God,
Yankee And so Hal Wallace had bought the play. Everyone Comes to Rick's.
Right.
Was looking for a director. He originally sussed out William Wyler, who was up at Sun Valley playing poker with Daryl Zanuck, and Zanuck just said, Weiler was not interested because Weiler had made The Letter previously at Warner Brothers, and he drove Jack Warner and everybody there up the wall with these endless takes. Jack Warner's advice, I think, to Curtiz over a quarter century could best be summed up by 2 words: hurry up. That was Jack's thing. So Wallace turned around and said, "Who's the best director I have?" And he considered Curtiz and Vince Sherman, but Curtiz was the #1 director on the lot, so he chose Curtiz.
Wow. And how does how does the casting of Ingrid Bergman come into play?
Ingrid Bergman was borrowed from David O. Selznick, and they worked out a swap deal where they lent Olivia de Havilland to Selznick. They got Bergman. I'm sure there was some cash involved too. And of course, Selznick always wanted to keep abreast of his huge gambling debts. So he in turn lent Olivia de Havilland out to RKO so he could get paid twice without having to make a movie. So Bergman was borrowed by Selznick. And it was very interesting for all of Curtiz's battles and differences with actors. He and Bergman got along famously. In fact, Bergman said, "I really like Michael Curtiz. I learned so much from him." And Curtiz, and this is a little theorizing on my part, I think he would have tried to have an affair with Bergman if it was much earlier on. And he got interviewed after Casablanca, and he said something, "I'm not too much popularity with actors and actresses, but Miss Bergman likes me." And he used to call everyone baby. Hey baby, go this, do this, but he called Bergman Christmas baby because she was extra special. So there was definitely a simpatico relationship between Bergman and Curtiz.
Now, is the ending filmed at Burbank Airport? Is that apocryphal or
no? That was filmed on stage 1 in Warner Brothers. And when Claude Rains and Bogart walk off in the oil vapor fog, that was on stage 1, and that the famous line, "Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." They had to get Bogart off his yacht. The picture had already ended to dub in what they called a wild line, and that was Hal Wallace who thought of that line. Actually. The only scene in Casablanca that was not filmed on the Warner Brothers sound stages or the lot was Colonel Strasser, Conrad Veidt, arriving where they meet him at the plane, and that was filmed at then Metropolitan Airport, which is now Van Nuys Airport.
Oh, Van Nuys
Airport. And so
they
filmed it, and Curtiz did a glass shot, a matte shot where you saw all the background of Casablanca. And that brief scene, and that was it. The rest of it was all shot at Warner Brothers.
Isn't there another kind of innovative thing where they're using little people to?
Yeah, the last scene where you have the climax with is she going to go away with Victor Laszlo or Bogart, and they have a long shot of guys putting stuff on the planes. The plane was a model, and the attendants were midgets. They put in clothing.
I love stuff
so
like,
it looks like
beautiful.
You're on a tarmac, and it was that was all done on a soundstage.
Did he have anything to do with the look of the film? Her famous hat, and I mean, from other
Bergman?
memos.
I'm sure he did. I didn't find anything specific, but I have pictures of him adjusting people's hair. I have a picture of him putting on makeup on Fay Wray and Dr. X. And even going to the Scarlet Hour in 1956, he's putting something on Carol Omart, who was terrified of him. She has this look on his face like, "Don't touch me," and Curtiz is adjusting something. So if he didn't like something, he would do something about it, whether it was wardrobe, whether it was the way the scene was lit, the script, anything. He would try to change it to what he believed was the right thing to do.
It's interesting. I remember they did a re-release of Casablanca. It was in the mid-'90s, I think I saw it, and it's grown on me so much. The scene where everybody stands and listens to the Marseillaise, it's just incredible.
And Paul Henreid as Victor Laszlo says, "Play it," but then they cut away, and the band leader looks at Bogart because Bogart's the boss, and it's his saloon, and you see Bogart go like that, and then they play it. But I mean, 75 years later, we're still talking about Casablanca. I think it's the greatest, arguably the greatest film ever made, certainly the greatest Hollywood studio film ever made.
So.
And
I think so.
it's one of those films, if I'm changing the channel and I see it on, I will stop and start looking at it again, and my wife will go through and look at me and just shake her head.
It's so iconic.
I can't help it.
So he finally won an Oscar. Was winning an Oscar important to him?
I think it was, from the standpoint of he had been nominated so many times.
Right.
He was nominated for Captain Blood and for Four Daughters and for Yankee Doodle Dandy. And his speech, which is, I listened to the Academy Library, the Herrick Library had it on, and he said something to the effect of, 4 times or 3 times I've been nominated for this great award. I prepared a speech. This time, I just want to thank everyone, and I'm grateful for 2-minute time limit. Thank you very much. And he got off. He was not a self-aggrandizing guy. It was very interesting. He sought publicity, but it was directed towards making his movies successful.
Right.
Because his greatest fear, because he was addicted to making movies.
Yeah.
And so his greatest fear was that the movie he finished wouldn't be a success because he might not be able to make any more movies.
Right.
And that became particularly acute in the 1950s as the studios downsized and television, and then the antitrust divestiture where the big 5 studios had to divest themselves of their theater chain, and then of course the blacklist that turned Hollywood and the entertainment industry upside down. And he had started his production company on the Warner lot in '47, made 4 movies, reasonably successful, but after, in the late '40s into the '50s, reasonably successful black and white movies didn't cut it anymore because the expenses had gone way up, and television and the competition. So it was tough. But he was always nervous about that and focused on that. He didn't want anyone to know about his personal life. He didn't want anyone to know that he had all these children by different women out of wedlock.
Right.
Any of that stuff. So he kind of struck that balance. And his wife's best friend was Luella Parsons. So in Luella Parsons' columns, there's always a mention of Curtiz. He's in there constantly.
Wow. So
about
how does he become like Soliari then, where he's sort of just cast aside in the '60s when they were writing about the great pantheon of directors? He just got completely excluded.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with timing. He died in beginning of '62, and this was before the renaissance of appreciation for Golden Age directors. So he wasn't around to be interviewed by Richard Schickel,
Right.
or be like Raoul Walsh, show up at these film screenings and tell stories about stealing John Barrymore's body with Peter Lorre and putting in Errol Flynn's house. All this, he wasn't around to do that.
Yeah.
He wasn't around for Peter Bogdanovich to interview.
too
That's
bad.
part of it. The other part of it is the auteur theory. Cassius de Cinema, and of course Andrew Sarris in his book. So the repeatable, discernible signatures through all his films. So Curtiz was kind of viewed as this vocational mechanic of
Right.
the studio system, and so forth. And I think the auteurists kind of gave him short shrift and didn't include him in that conversation, as you said.
So then he does Mildred Pierce, another great film.
Right.
With just an incredible performance from Joan Crawford. Now,
Right.
is that true? All the stuff that he ripped her shoulder pads off?
That's what Crawford said. I think he wanted Barbara Stanwyck, and Stanwyck either wasn't available, didn't want the part. And remember, Crawford had been cut loose by MGM as box office poison. Now, Jack Warner, who was always looking to squeeze a nickel hard enough to make the Buffalo pass out, he saw an opportunity to pick up Crawford at kind of a bargain basement price compared
Right.
to MGM. He had her there. She really hadn't done anything. She was in a cameo in Hollywood Canteen, wartime movie. And so this was her last best chance. And she showed up the first time coiffed and everything on the set, and Curtiz messed up her hair and said, no, you start out, you're a Hausfrau. You don't want to. So
Yeah.
then she bought a frock at Sears for 75 cents to bake. That was the part of the movie where she was baking pies.
Right.
To get Vita her dancing lessons and music lessons. And Curtiz went over and according to Crawford, tore the frock off her and said, "No MGM shoulder pads," and she went crying into her dressing room. But eventually, they established this relationship, and Crawford said he gave me a postgraduate course in humiliation, and then he started training me.
Interesting.
And he really respected Crawford because Crawford was after what was best for the picture, not just what was best for her, because she realized if the picture's good, then she will be successful. And Anne Blythe, when she did her screen test, Crawford was there doing the screen test with her. She didn't, duck out and play the big star. So Curtiz really respected that, and they ended up getting along fine after the initial dust-up.
It seems like, if I was going to take a thread through this, because then after that, he has this great working relationship with Doris Day, is that maybe he was this kind of personal building up, tearing a person down and then building them up. I mean,
well, that was I think he came from the old European school of directors viewing actors as marionettes or putty to be molded and so on and so forth. I do know with Doris Day, once he signed her to his production company for Romance on the High Seas, he found out she's taking acting lessons, and he ended that, and he gave her this long lecture that's in Doris Day's book saying, you have very rare thing. You have this personality. You have this star personality.
Yeah.
Don't start taking acting lessons because you're going to screw it all up.
Right.
Just be yourself because that's why I hired you. And then Doris Day wanted to look at the dailies, and he forbade it. He said, if it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you.
Wow.
Because he was afraid that she would succumb to either star ego, which was not part of her personality, quite frankly, or she would start trying to act and be caught acting and be artificial and so forth. So looking back, I think he really did the right thing with Doris Day on how he handled her initially. And in addition to that, she worked very closely with Jack Carson in her first two films.
I
and
love.
he was a total pro, and she learned a lot from Jack Carson as well as Curtiz.
Did he have a movie aside from Casablanca or Mildred Pierce that was like his personal favorite or his film that he wanted to?
His favorite was always his next film.
Yeah,
he
that's
was always,
funny.
He even in his personal relationships for the most part, he was always looking ahead. I do believe he had more fun and enjoyment making Yankee Doodle Dandy than any of his other pictures at Warner Brothers because he was hyper patriotic. I mean, he was a Jew that grew up under an emperor, knew anti-Semitism. He had to get his mother and two of his brothers out during World War II, and part of his family ended up in Auschwitz and dying. So the whole American freedom and democracy, I mean, he really believed that. And when you see Yankee Doodle today, those on your sleeve patriotic themes that people find as corny, that held the most appeal for him.
Right.
The other thing about that is he worked really well with James Cagney. And when Cagney made Yankee Doodle Dandy, he had probably more power than any star in Hollywood. He had gone through a series of suspensions with Jack Warner over pay and material. And when he came back, he signed a contract in 1938, which gave him a whole bunch of rights that other stars did not have, including a happiness clause, which was, if I'm not happy with Jack Warner or Wallace or anybody else, I can leave. And also that his brother, Bill Cagney, would be the associate producer of his films. So Curtiz and the Cagneys ended up making the film, and then Hal Wallace was, you need to use a horse in this scene and this and that, and Jack Warner, you're behind schedule, and all of this stuff started. And then Jim Cagney said, I think I'm gonna leave after this picture. I think I'm gonna leave. And then immediately Jack Warner and Wallace backed off.
Yeah.
So he didn't have to deal with the constant, Warner and Wallace doing this to Curtiz. And Cagney respected Curtiz. He didn't particularly like the way he treated people. And Joan Leslie told me, he said, watching Cagney and Curtiz work together was just joyful because Cagney wasn't going to tell Curtiz, you need to give me a close-up here, or you need to block this way.
Right.
And Curtiz was not going to tell Cagney how to dance or how to sing or everything. So they really work well together.
And then we're running out of time. I want to make sure that he, one of the things that I thought was interesting was he wasn't a director whose career really faltered and faded away. Like he continued, I mean, he did a movie with Elvis. I thought that was really bizarre to go.
Yeah, he left Warner Brothers and made White Christmas, which in terms of box office was the biggest, most successful movie he ever directed.
Yeah.
And his films after that became of decreasing quality. I mean, he was now 70 years old.
Right.
And gained on. However, several of his latter films, the one with Elvis Presley, which he got along with Elvis famously. And part of that was Hal Wallis. Hal Wallis brought him back to direct the picture and said, you will use kid gloves with Elvis. Because at that point, Elvis was a shy country boy who liked to quote the Bible. And Curtiz was very gentle with him, and he was completely, Elvis would show up early on the set with all his lines memorized, and what do you want me to do, Mr. Curtiz? And King Creole, Elvis always thought it was his best film, as I do.
Yeah.
And then there was The Proud Rebel with Alan Ladd. He was reunited with Olivia de Havilland after 15 years, and David Ladd, which is a terrific film. So he did have some late-term success, but some of his later movies were not that good.
You go into some of the problems. But again, I was making notes as I was watching it. I'm going to have a whole Michael Curtiz film festival.
It's a long festival.
I know. I kept thinking, when does his career end? Oh, it keeps going.
Well, they had to literally carry him off the location of the Comancheros because he was riddled with cancer, didn't know it, and was basically dying on location in Utah. And he finally fell, hurt his leg, and they x-rayed it, and he was filled with cancer. And they sent him back to Hollywood, and John Wayne directed at least half of the picture.
But it was now I love little inside stories like that, because then you want to kind of see, well, what did he do and what did Wayne do and all of that.
Right.
So you've been promoting the book, and I want to make sure to get to your film festival, because we haven't even talked about noir, which is
we have not.
Your other hobby. You just had the Palm Springs Noir Fest.
Yes, the Arthur Lyons Film Noir Festival.
Yes.
And this was the 19th year of it, and I've been involved like for 18 years with Arthur Lyons. Art passed away in 2008, and he was a really great mystery writer, was a city councilman in Palm Springs. We were close friends. And after 2008, I was asked to take it over, so I've been doing it now 11 or 12 years, and we had our biggest year ever, just finished this weekend. I had Farewell My Lovely, I had Jack O'Halloran there, who had more Mitchum stories than I even knew was possible. I had Victoria Price, Vincent Price's daughter, Victoria Mature, and I had Ruta Lee for Witness for the Prosecution. And the festival goes back to when we used to have people like Tony Curtis and Jane Russell.
So
I had Borgnine there, and so we're continuing the tradition. And Eddie Muller comes and helps me introduce the films along with Foster Hirsch, and it's like the old home week for me, because I have all these friends and a core audience that's very, very appreciative. And the Camelot Theater there's nothing better. I mean, Robert Mitchum would have approved to show one of his movies in a theater that has an elevator and 3 bars in it. So there's nothing. It's the best place I've been for an adult to watch movies.
Well, the San Francisco Noir Fest is...
Oh, yeah, Noir City in San Francisco.
Well,
that's Eddie's hometown. And
another great theater.
The audience up there, where I used to I brought Marsha Hunt up there for the first time, and Joan Leslie and the other guests. And, I remember we arrived with Joan Leslie in a car, and it was pouring rain, just pouring rain. And she got out, and we looked down Castro Street. There was this line going all the way down the block around the corner with umbrellas. It looked like that scene with Hitchcock in Foreign Correspondent with all the umbrellas. And, Wednesday night, you have 1,400 people
Yeah.
see The Man Who Cheated Himself with Lee J. Cobb. I mean, it's incredible.
It's really fun. What is the film noir is like bigger. It's bigger than ever. I think movie going in general is, the TCM Film Festival.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
what is it about noir that just, boy, we have really reached, it's getting more and more popular.
Well, I think, noir has become a brand now. Now
Right.
you don't have detective novels, you have noir novels and
Right.
noir perfume and noir aftershave. So that's part of it is a marketing thing. But I do think that the stories in film noir involving lust,
Yeah.
larceny, fatalism, making the wrong decision and paying for it in the end, we have a new generation of classic film lovers that gravitate toward that because of the actors and the stories and the photography and the fact that, a doctor may be treating a woman with a lit cigarette in their
Right.
mouth, or someone's holding a Bakelite phone the size of a dachshund,
Yeah.
and all this stuff. A current generation of filmgoers can look beyond that and see what's in the story and so on and so forth. And I think also the subtlety, because of the censorship code, that stuff isn't out there in the open. It's
Yeah.
not flung in your face. It's very subtle and nuanced. And I think there's appreciation for that as far as storytelling goes. So there's no doubt film noir sells. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think too something about is the simplicity of the right and wrong and a girl at a bus stop, and we could all it's not complicated, you know what I mean? It's like what you're in for, and
and the voiceover narrative and the flashback, and you see a picture like Raw Deal, and you have this theremin going, "Doo," and then Claire Trevor's voice going, "This is the day.
I know.
This is the day I get the man I love out of prison," and they show this establishing shot of San Quentin.
right.
Yeah.
Or you have your favorite people, like for me, I guess it's Robert Ryan. Like I'd
Ryan's
watch
great.
Robert Ryan in just about anything.
Robert Ryan is great. I'm friendly with Lisa Ryan, the daughter, and when Ryan had his centennial in 2009.
Yeah.
I showed the setup, and I had Marcia Hunt, who had acted in a play with him back in the day, and Lisa, and Robert Ryan is just a spectacular actor.
Yeah.
I'm partial to Charles McGraw as well, but yeah, the actors, and there's certainly truth to what Norma Desmond said, where she said, "We have faces."
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, Alan, thank you so much for being here. It's been great.
Ileana, it's been a pleasure, a privilege. Thank you for having me, and let's do it again sometime.
My
It was
God,
great.
come back anytime. We'll do an hour just on Jack Carson.
Yeah.
I know, right?
I have to add one thing about
Sure.
Jack Carson. When I was going through my mother's stuff, she went to Ben Bard Acting School, I think, in Hollywood, and knew Carson. And I found this photograph, All My Love, Jack.
What?
And I looked at that and I said, what is this? And my mother said, "Oh, I told you that."
Oh.
So I have a framed autographed picture of Jack Carson on the wall of my home office, courtesy of my mom.
He's. I never understood why Mildred turned him down. I thought he was great. He's a
little too. I think Joan was a little too serious. There's too much of the huckster in Jack. Too much of the used car salesman in Jack, in that character.
If he hadn't betrayed her towards the end, he has me.
Well,
the first half of the movie, I'm like.
Well, doesn't that mean her instincts about him were kind of correct?
At least
Mildred's instincts.
I guess she's I
Yeah.
would have ended up with him.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You can find Alan on Twitter at Alan
Yes.
Cinephile. Also look for his book, Michael Curtiz, A Life in Film,
It's excellent.
on Amazon, as well as his other books, because you have several other books. as
That's
well,
right.
don't
One other
you?
book, Charles McGraw, Film Noir Tough
That's
Guy.
the one I was thinking of.
Right.
And don't forget, he's co-hosting the upcoming Noir City Festival in Austin this weekend.
Oh yeah, this Sunday I will be there
On the
introducing
move.
films and hopefully signing a lot of books.
Yes,
Yes,
hopefully.
you will. All
Thank
right.
you so much, Alan. And you can buy Ileana's
Thank
book,
you.
I
That's
Blame
right.
Dennis Hopper
The little book.
on
The little book.
Amazon
The
and
book
in
that-
bookstores. It's a good book. You should buy it. Get them both. Also, like our Facebook page,
That's
and
right.
our website is ilianaspodcast.com.
That's right. And like I like to always end the show, everyone's life is like a movie with a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is the end of our podcast for today. Thank you, Alan. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ileana.
See you
We're
next
out.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.